Now, in the first video on submarine warfare, which is here, I mentioned how the German U-boats sunk more and more ships crossing the Atlantic until the trend was reversed by using various tactics and weapons and putting an end to the first happy time for the U-boats. Now, this trend was reversed by using tactics and weapons like ley lights, long-range aircraft, depth charges, and, of course, breaking German ciphers. The second happy time for the U-boats started, surprisingly enough, when America joined the war, beginning of 1942. This was for two reasons. One was there were many more ships crossing the Atlantic, and the other was that Admiral King, the commander of the US naval forces, he didn't like the limeys, and he wasn't going to take any advice from the British. The British suggested turning off lighthouses and imposing a blackout along the Atlantic coast. But Admiral King was having nothing of that. So ships would come out from New York, and a submarine out in the Atlantic could see it silhouetted against the skyline of Manhattan and sink it. And then another ship would come out and they'd sink that one. Now, this operation was called Drumbeat by the Germans. And during this time, 25% of all the ships sunk during the war were sunk. The second happy time for the U-boats sunk twice as many ships as the first happy time. It took a year before the tactics were developed to reverse this trend. Now, Gilbert Roberts had been a captain in the Royal Navy from 1935. He'd studied wargaming, but in 1938 he contracted tuberculosis and was invalided out of the Navy. Now, this was a hard blow to him. At the beginning of the war, the Western Approach Command was at Plymouth, and it controlled the shipping in the Atlantic. Now, when France fell, the Germans now had access to ports on the French Atlantic coast, and so ships were sent around the top of Ireland to keep them as far away from the submarines and German ships as possible. So Western Approach's command was moved to Liverpool. With the outbreak of the war, Captain Roberts had been reinstated in the Navy, and in January 1942, he was called to Liverpool to meet Admiral Noble, and he was asked to set up a team which would be called the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, in order to combat the submarine threat. Most of the staff at Liverpool were already Wrens, that's a Women's Royal Naval Service. Roberts recruited more Wrens. They were chosen depending on their intelligence and their prowess in mathematics. These Wrens knew nothing about naval tactics or ships, but mathematics was vital for understanding vectors. The rest they would learn on the job. Now, Janet Okell was one of the youngest Wrens. She turned up for the interview in her school uniform, and she got lost in the maze of corridors in Derby House. And when she met Roberts, she was in tears. Now, Derby House had a 7-foot thick roof to protect it from possible bombing raids. The main room had a large map on the wall showing the Atlantic, where they could show where convoys were. Next to the map and on the small side wall, there were charts showing the convoy lists and the available planes. Opposite the map, on mezzanine floor, there was an office for the Naval Command and an office for the RAF Coastal Command. The top floor of Derby House had a large empty room, and Roberts was going to use this for his wargaming. The floor was covered with linoleum, and he marked squares on it 10 inches by 10 inches, each square representing 1 nautical mile. Now, Roberts read many after-action reports to find out how U-boats attacked and how escort ships reacted. He realized that the reactions depended more on luck than reflection. Escorts would often dash to help the stricken ship or drop depth charges randomly. He reflected on the best option for U-boat commanders and came to the conclusion that the best method of attack was to be inside the defense ring of the escort ships. The range of a German torpedo was 5,400 yards, so they couldn't be too far away. He went to call up a friend at Submarine Command, The phone was answered by Admiral Max Horton. Roberts explained his theory, and Horton said that's exactly what he would do as a submarine commander. It was late in the day, but Chief Yeoman Raynor, Jean Laidlaw, and Janet Okell all stayed to test out the theory. And they had a convoy with an escort of 6 ships. All night they tried different approaches. It became evident that the best option for the submarine was to approach from the stern, where lookouts really looked, and attack from inside the convoy. Roberts wanted to demonstrate his theory. The setup for the war game was on the top floor. The linoleum was marked with a grid of 10-inch squares, and there were small models representing ships and brown models for the U-boats. The trajectory of the convoys and the escort ships was marked in white, and the trajectory of the U-boats was marked in brown chalk. Now, the escort captains for the game were around the periphery of the setup. Behind a screen, they were looking through a small slit which was covered in brown gauze, so they could see the escort ships, the convoy ships, and the white trajectory, but they couldn't see the brown U-boats or the trajectory of the U-boats. The U-boat captains were inside the setup. They could see everything. Now, the escort commander would hand his instructions through a small hatch to a Wren, who would move his ship accordingly. The sceptical Sir Percy Noble turned up with his staff, and Roberts' team went through a series of demonstrations showing a standard response to attacks which wasn't very effective. Roberts then explained the theory that the U-boat would dive and let the convoy go over it, and that the response should be for the escort ships to come around the back of the convoy and use their azadics to sweep, as the U-boat was then detectable as the convoy moved across it. Now, Jean Laidlaw baptized his tactic as a raspberry. It was blowing a raspberry to Hitler. As Sir Percy Noble was impressed, he instructed all escort captains to attend a WATU course, and that the raspberry tactic should be put into operation. Roberts went to London to read transcripts of interrogations with captured German submariners, and found that the team's idea fitted reality. The naval officers attending WATU course were being instructed by young Wrens. And of the 5,000 officers who attended, none of them had any problems with this. The WATU team had to be constantly thinking outside the box. How would the Germans react to this sudden increase in U-boat kills? Or there could be a U-boat commander observing the convoy and seeing what the escort ships did. Several countermeasures were devised, having names following the lead of raspberry. There was strawberry, gooseberry, and pineapple. If a U-boat was detected and knew it, the commander had the choice of sending a signal to the others, then diving, or diving, then surfacing later to send a signal. Most U-boat commanders would choose to dive immediately. The beta search tactic was for an escort to head calmly in the direction of the U-boat, inducing the U-boat to dive. Then when the escort was between the U-boat and the convoy, its propeller would be masked by the sound of the propellers of the convoy, and it could dash towards where the U-boat had seen diving and launch depth charges. Sir Max Horton was now commander of Western Approaches. He visited WATU, and he did something that no senior officer should do. He wargamed against subordinates. He had been a submarine commander, so he was playing the U-boat commander. Very shortly, he was sunk, and so he tried again, and he was sunk again. After 5 times being sunk, he wanted to know who this talented captain was, and found it was the 18-year-old Janet Okell. Unfortunately, he put results before ego and insisted that the beta search should be included in the next fleet orders. HMS Vidette was the first ship to use this tactic and sunk a U-boat. Pineapple was suggested by a Canadian taking part in the course. He was suggesting what the Germans could do in reaction to raspberry. When he drew a plan of his idea, it looked like a pineapple. Pineapple was to counter the measures that the Germans might take in response to raspberry. It was based on the knowledge that not all U-boat commanders were equally aggressive. And when the Germans realized the British were using the raspberry tactics, a group of submarines would approach from the front, starburst shells would be fired, and the escorts would charge forward. Now, some U-boats would sink and escape, others would sink and let the escorts go over them, knowing that their ASDIC couldn't be used while they were at full steam. So, estimating that some of the U-boats would let the escorts go over them, now the escorts would turn back towards the convoy and use their ASDICs to sweep and catch any submarines that had done this. In response to the growing success of WATU tactics, Donitz increased the size of the wolf packs. This reduced the effectiveness of the countermeasures. This problem was in turn countered by having more aircraft available and aircraft carriers, or even landing strips mounted on top of cargo ships. The spring of '43 was a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. In April '43, Peter Gretton's group was escorting convoy ONS 5 with 42 merchant ships from the UK to the US. There were 2 wolf packs in the Atlantic, totaling 58 U-boats. The Liberator sunk U-710 and raised the alarm. High Frequency Detection Finder, HFDF, located a U-boat, but no contact was made. 14 U-boats were closing in. So Gretton concentrated his escorts on the port beam. That means the left, and that was the south in this case. During the night, 3 U-boats moved in, and escorts rushed to make them dive. During the next night, the U-boat made a hit. The weather was bad, making air support impossible, but the U-boats weren't making a coordinated attack. Gretton had to withdraw his ship as it had boiler problems and a lack of fuel. Now there were 30 U-boats, and they managed to sink 11 merchant ships. Fog now descended, giving the advantage to the escorts and their ASDICs. When they reached port, they lost 13 out of 42 ships and had sunk 7 U-boats. Now in May 1943, Gretton was with convoy SC-130. His escorts forced a group of U-boats to dive, and the convoy changed course. Liberators came in to hunt the pursuing submarines, and Gretton's Hedgehog damaged U-381. More Liberators came in, and the Huff-Duff indicated another pack, so they changed course to avoid it. They arrived at port, having lost no ships, and having sunk 3 U-boats. Donitz was losing so many U-boats for little return that he pulled most of the submarines out of the North Atlantic. But he wasn't going to give up. Some strange incidents started to happen to test the team's analytic skills. A ship was hit, and an escort rushing to its aid was hit in the stern. Ships helping the stricken ship were not attacked. An escort ship heading towards a submarine was hit in the stern, which seemed impossible. The team reflected on this and came up with the actual reason. The Germans must have an acoustic torpedo. Now, they couldn't be used against an immobile ship as it made no propeller noise. The torpedo could hit the rear of an approaching ship as it was homing in on the propeller. And not having the specs of the torpedo, they had to guess how it worked. If the detection angle was too narrow, the torpedo risked missing the target. If it was too wide, the torpedo might hit another submarine. So they decided the optimum angle that it could work on was 60 degrees. They developed the step-aside tactic. When the escort spotted a U-boat, it would head towards it and fire a starburst shell, forcing the U-boat to dive. Now the escort ship would turn 150 degrees and steam at 15 knots. After a mile, it would turn and go parallel to the direction of the submarine, and after another mile, it would head towards the position of the submarine. Now the submarine, when it was diving, couldn't fire the torpedo, but once it was stable, it could fire it. And if the escort was in the same position or going towards the submarine, the torpedo would hit it. But with this step-aside tactic, the ship wasn't within the range. Now, another anti-acoustic measure was the Foxter. It was towed behind a ship and it made more noise than the propeller did. So that would attract the acoustic torpedo. For an escort ship, this meant that they couldn't use their ASDIC, but it was useful for merchant ships. Now, the Germans weren't great at spying on the British, but they knew who Captain Roberts was. Admiral Donitz found a picture of him in a magazine and he showed it to his submarine commanders. He said, "This is your enemy." Another training facility was set up at HMS Strike, and the Canadians set one up in Nova Scotia. Now, American officers were forbidden to attend a WATU course, but some of them did anyway. And finally, the Americans set up an anti-submarine training course. Now, many aspects of the war can be said to be vital. The Battle of Britain, Enigma, D-Day. One battle that was absolutely vital was the Battle of Atlantic. If that had been lost, nothing else mattered. WATU wasn't the only element in this victory, but it played more than a significant role in the success. And like deciphering enemy messages, the anti-submarine tactics were kept top secret for many years, and so it wasn't mentioned in many history books. And some of the Wrens didn't even tell their husbands what they'd been doing during the war. Of the 5,000 participants in the WATU course, one was Prince Philip, and another one was Nicholas Monsarat. Now, he wrote a novel which was based on his own experiences as a captain of a frigate escorting these convoys. There's a link in the description. Now, Roberts suffered a hard blow when he was invalided out of the Navy, but at the end of 1943, he was awarded the MBE. He took a Wren with him to the palace to show that it was actually a team effort. He suffered a second hard blow when he was offered a knighthood. You might think, well, he should be chuffed at that. Well, he was. But the next day, he got a call to say it was a mistake. No other explanation. In 1945, he visited Flensburg in Germany, and he actually met Admiral Donitz. He was surprised to see a photo of himself on the wall, and he autographed it